President Trump appointed New York lawyer and businessman Jason Greenblatt as an assistant to the president and special representative for international negotiations in December 2016. Greenblatt is the primary architect of Trump's Israel-Palestine peace plan called the Deal of the Century. He left the White House in September 2019 to pursue his own business goals and joined Our Crowd, a global venture investment platform, as a partner with the responsibilities of building ties in the Middle East. His social media, if you want to follow him, is on Twitter at GreenblattJD, and on Facebook you can find him there also. Jason, thank you so much for giving the Arab News and myself this opportunity to interview you.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for allowing me to share my views with your audience.
The Deal of the Century has created controversy, but I will remember that in the beginning, and I think this goes back to 2017, it looked like the Palestinians in particular were very encouraged by Trump's election. You had met with them, I believe, right after you were appointed. It seemed to go really positive. What was that like? Just to remind us how things can be good sometimes. But it was very positive in the beginning, wasn't it?
It was. We had open minds when we met with both the Israelis and the Palestinians. You know, we might have come into office with preconceived notions, but our directive for President Trump was to keep an open mind, study the conflict, speak to not only the leadership on both sides, but the leadership in the region, leadership around the world that had worked on prior peace efforts. And my own particular favorite was also speaking to ordinary people, ordinary Israelis and Palestinians. And I would say that until December of 2017, our relationship, maybe the end of November perhaps, the relationship with the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah was fairly strong. Of course, we can't forget about the fact that there is a separate Palestinian leadership, if you can call them leadership, the terrorist organization Hamas in Gaza that subjugates 2 million Palestinians who are suffering there. So it's hard to speak and negotiate for the Palestinians when you're not sure who really has the authority to speak for them. But we assume that hopefully President Abbas will speak for all Palestinians. And we had a lot of very thoughtful discussions with them. What happened at the end of 2017, two things actually. One, when President Abbas spoke at the United Nations General Assembly in the fall of 2017, he threatened to bring Israel to the International Criminal Court. Under U.S. law, that required our government to close the PLO mission in Washington, D.C. We had extensive discussions.
So that wasn't anything you recommended. You didn't recommend those actions. That was mandated by laws that have been passed in the United States.
Yeah, that's a great point for you to make. They couched it as if we were trying to put pressure on the Palestinian Authority. But in fact, we tried to work with the Palestinian Authority to be able to keep the PLO mission open, but we could only do so under one condition: if they were actively engaged in good faith negotiations with Israel. Shortly thereafter, and we hadn't yet closed it, but shortly thereafter, President Trump made his historic decision about Jerusalem. And there too, I want to sort of set the record straight here. President Trump, and I give him tremendous credit, I supported the decision. I encouraged the decision among many other people in the administration. But he too, in making that decision of recognizing Jerusalem as the capital and moving the embassy, was following U.S. law that was passed in 1995 that each presidential candidate, since that law was passed, including President Trump, promised to follow. I'm not going to pass judgment on the prior presidents who didn't follow through on their promise. I wasn't in the room when they ran their analysis as to whether it posed a national security risk to the United States. But President Trump concluded that the only way he would not be able to honor the promise was under the law, which means if he was willing to sign a national security waiver not to honor the law. And after running an extensive process, he concluded that he was not able to sign that waiver. And he wanted to honor the promise he made to the American people to respect the law of the United States. It was not intended to be a pressure tactic against the Palestinians. And I'm sorry, just let me close with one other thing and then get back to it. A lot of people say Well, why did you do that? Why wouldn't you use that as a bargaining chip in the negotiations with the Palestinians? Why would you give Israel this? And what they don't understand is the U.S. law does not allow for that bargaining chip. The U.S. law was clear. It recognized that Jerusalem was and always will be the capital of Israel. I think the president's speech, which if you haven't read and if your audience hasn't read, I really, really encourage you to do so, because while it explained the rationale and, of course, it recognized the importance of Jerusalem to the Jewish people and to the state of Israel, it left open something for the Palestinians to discuss. But that's where it all unraveled, and the Palestinian Authority cut ties to the administration and has since kept those ties cut.
Now, I recall in the beginning, President Trump seemed to delay that decision. Didn't he kind of put that off for a while? I know many presidents have done it, but it sounded like he was going to hold it back. So was the timing bad, do you think, for this process between the ICC, following the declaration of, recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel? It seems that your effort would have been much easier to achieve if a lot of those things hadn't happened in the beginning.
It's hard to tell. He wanted to honor his promise quickly, but when you step into government, there are so many things that you have to do, and the process by which he needed to go through to determine if there would be an issue with honoring the promise was quite an extensive process. But what we did do throughout the administration was we bifurcated the peace effort from everything else. We weren't going to follow what happened in the past and say, well, if we don't do this or if we don't do that, we'll have a better chance at the peace effort. We viewed U.S. law as U.S. law. We are going to follow U.S. law. The peace process is another channel. I'm not going to say that we didn't discuss the connection points between them, but we also came to the realization that holding off on following U.S. law and holding off on tough decisions that the U.S. had to make, including cutting of funds for UNRWA and other decisions like that are so important for the U.S. taxpayer, should not be tied to a peace process that has taken decades and has gone nowhere. One of the unique things I think that the Palestinian Authority missed, and I tried very hard to explain this to them, is that President Trump put 3 people in charge of this peace effort who he has known for decades and who are extraordinarily close to him. So you have Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, who led the effort, a good friend of mine. You had also a good friend of mine, Ambassador David Friedman, our ambassador to Israel, and then me. I am a 23-year veteran of working for President Trump, 20 years in the private sector, nearly 3 in public service. David Friedman also has known and worked with President Trump probably for about 2 decades. I don't know the exact number of years. Jared Kushner obviously is married to his daughter Ivanka and is very, very close to him. And what the Palestinian Authority didn't recognize, though the rest of the region, Israel and other countries in the region did, is that you had people close to President Trump who were entrusted with this task and whose advice should have been received. So when we explained to them that we were going to follow through on the Jerusalem promise that the president made, or we were going to follow through on the PLO mission, or funds relating to UNRWA, we meant it. We weren't trying to negotiate. We weren't trying to put pressure. We were simply giving them facts. And they had the ability to help us get through these tough decisions in a way that could have been less dramatic. But they have their own style. It's not for me to criticize their style. And they chose to, I think they felt that we weren't telling them the truth, that we would never do these things. And I think they ended up being surprised, though they shouldn't have been, that we followed through on what we said.
So you feel maybe there was an expectation that these things wouldn't actually move forward, but you're saying that that was always the intent, that those required actions that were defined by U.S. law were going to be pursued regardless of what would happen at the negotiations.
Yeah, I'm not sure I quite understand the question, but I think I would say it like this. Others before us made the same promise and didn't follow through. So I think the leadership on the Palestinian side felt we too would not follow through.
Got it.
We assured them that President Trump is a guy who likes to keep his word and will do everything he can to keep his word. And they shouldn't look at past administrations and assume that it would be the same. But they either felt that we were wrong, felt that we were trying to mislead them, felt that they could change President Trump's mind. I don't exactly know what their theory was, but they did not take our advice and understand that there was a way to move forward even though these decisions were going to happen.
Do you think, perception is reality, and perception impacts everything. From the Palestinian side, and you mentioned that, there was Ambassador Friedman, and there was Jared Kushner. I met Jared, by the way, in Bahrain. I was one of the few Palestinians who actually went there to cover that Peace to Prosperity conference. Do you think the perception, though, was that this was stacked against the Palestinians? I mean, was there any possibility they could have included a Palestinian among 3 Jewish individuals who were kind of overseeing it? And I'm not saying that just because you're Jewish you're going to be biased, but the perception might be that maybe the experience of one side wasn't represented in the effort that was put together by the president.
Well, except that in 2017, the Palestinians were well represented on their side, meaning we spent a very significant number of hours with Saeb Erekat, with President Abbas, with others, and we heard from them directly what they were looking for. We obviously did the same with the Israelis. Even after 2017, we spent a great deal of time with other Palestinians, whether they're business leaders, teenagers, ordinary citizens, to hear what the Palestinians wanted. But ultimately, what people want, what people aspire to, and what could be achieved are different things. So we well recognize that the Palestinian leadership over the decades has promised things to the Palestinian people and are seeking a certain solution to this conflict that they believe that they're entitled to. But what they're asking for is simply not achievable. What they're asking for, in our view, actually is not grounded in rights. Now, I know we have a conflict with some around the world who say that under international law, certain things need to be a certain way. The United States, at least under the Trump administration, though I'd argue even under prior administrations, does not agree that international law is binding the way others, perhaps like the European Union and the United Nations, argue. So, for example, let's take one of the seminal UN resolutions on this, 242. 242 speaks as though there is to be a negotiation on what the borders are. The Palestinian leadership speaks as though the 67 borders are sacrosanct. I know that in talks sometimes they'll say that they could be moved a little bit here and there, but they believe they're entitled to the land that the armistice lines were drawn on. But that isn't what 242 says in our view. The Palestinian leadership says that all of East Jerusalem, including the Old City, including what Muslims call the Haram al-Sharif, where 2 holy spots are for Muslims, what the Jews call, and I'm a Jewish man, the Temple Mount, where we had 2 temples, one stood. They believe that all of that belongs to them. Yet there is no single piece of paper that is legally binding that suggests that East Jerusalem belongs to the Palestinians. In fact, I made a speech at the UN Security Council to that point. The Palestinian aspiration to a capital, well, the formulation they like to use is that all of East Jerusalem will be their capital. Others use the formulation that there'll be a capital in East Jerusalem. But in either case, there is no binding international law that suggests that.
That's true, but when you're negotiating, you would think that there might be a willingness on the part of an Israeli government to compromise on that. And we've heard many times, I was involved in the 1993 Oslo Accords with Rabin and Arafat in the sense of being invited there to help sell the plan to Palestinians in the United States, because at that time President Clinton believed that the influence of Americans, Jewish, Palestinian, would have an impact in making the plan successful. They put a priority here in the U.S. But it seemed like there was some willingness to find a way to make that sharing of some aspect of East Jerusalem possible. Is that impossible at this point, in your view?
Well, we thought that our plan did just that. Perhaps we certainly didn't go as far as the Palestinians would want. To some, we went further than certain groups of Israelis would want. But to get to the answer to your question, which is a very important one, we need to get the 2 sides to the table, because it isn't going to be the United States, the United Nations, the EU, Russia, who will be able to force a deal. Nobody could force a deal here. So in my view, having spent not only 3 years working at the White House, deeply involved in this, but also many months since then, separated, but still actively involved in many discussions around the world about the conflict. Step one, in my view, is the Palestinian leadership has to get its house in order. Even in the best of circumstances, if President Abbas were willing to sit down with Israel's government today, it still doesn't answer the question, which is how do we fold Gaza into this equation? Gaza must be folded into this equation. It was the rare Palestinian who I met who suggested that there should be two individual states, a state in Gaza and a state in the West Bank, and despite the difference between the two societies and the lack of a connection, and our plan contemplates a connection, but just about everybody believes there has to be a connection. But the animosity between the leadership in Ramallah and so-called leadership in Gaza is just about as bad as it comes. So until you get your house in order, there's really nothing to discuss.
Yeah, Palestinians. Go ahead, sorry.
No, please, Ray, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that there are Palestinians like myself who believe, that Hamas has been an impediment to peace moving forward. They were an impediment to the 1993 process. But I do recall Leah Rabin somewhat blaming Netanyahu's views in the environment, the political environment that he created after her husband was assassinated, with causing his assassination, and saying that type of extremism existed and blocked the peace process. My point being that there's problems on both sides, and the Palestinians dealing with Hamas, it's not as easy, I don't think, as the Israelis dealing with extremism, because for us, the Palestinians are under an occupation still with limited resources, limited actions. They're not really an independent government, and maybe they would be under a peace plan where they would be able to deal with Hamas once a peace plan were implemented. But I get the point. As long as there appears to be two governments, Hamas and the PNA, it would make it very difficult for anybody to reach a peace agreement.
I think that's right. But I want to touch on something you mentioned just now,
Sure.
But also tied back to your Bahrain conference comment, because it's a very important point.
Sure.
And thank you for joining us in Bahrain, because that was another example of the Palestinian Authority trying to undermine an effort for the Palestinian people. Nobody was trying to write a $50 billion check to the Palestinians and saying, here's your money, now go away. That is not only incredibly disrespectful, it's completely unrealistic, right? What we were trying to do is say, if we manage to figure out how to get out of this conflict, you will be able to have all of this massive capital infusion to build up a new state to become something remarkable. I'll also point out that, Israel built up something remarkable over 70 years under very adverse conditions. War, terror attacks, being isolated in the region. If we reach a peace agreement, the Palestinian Authority is going to have a very easy path to building up something unique and hopefully as spectacular as Israel, because the entire world will be there to support them with money and with assistance. Unfortunately, they chose to try to undermine the conference. As you know, it sounds like perhaps people might have criticized you for being there. Yes. Palestinians were forbidden from going. We were fortunate that there were about a dozen or 15 Palestinians who were courageous enough to join us there. Some were actually jailed after they returned to the West Bank, which really is not surprising, but remarkable. And it was a tremendous missed opportunity. I spent a lot of time at the beginning of my time at the White House trying to figure out how to connect Palestinians and improve their economy. I'll tell you why. On my first official trip to Israel, I met Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister, who was extolling the virtues of a deal. Mobileye had just been sold for a very, very significant amount of money, and he was explaining how wonderful that was for the Israeli economy. From there, we drove to, I think it was Ramallah, it might have been Bethlehem, and there were young Palestinian tech entrepreneurs who I met. One of them came up to me and he said, Jason, he showed me the article on his phone about Mobileye. He said, please help us Palestinians help build our own Mobileye so we can succeed too. And I took that to heart, and I spent a great deal of time trying to explain to the Palestinian Authority, we hope to achieve peace, but even if we don't, or while we're trying to achieve it, let's build up your economy so that when peace is achieved, your economy will be already on the way to becoming something strong. And I was just never able to convince them. They were very interested only in scoring their political points and making their political points. They were completely disinterested in anything that having to do with helping the Palestinian people move forward.
Well, I mean, listen, critics might argue with you about that, and I don't want to get into that too much, but you're basically saying that it's a mistake on the part of the Palestinian leadership for not being in Bahrain for the Peace to Prosperity. It was a mistake for the Palestinians not to engage in the deal of the century. In other words, if you presented something to me and said, this is our offer, normally I might counter and say, I don't like it. Here's what I would suggest. That never happened, correct?
Correct.
And is that their big mistake?
Yeah, let me say it like this. When I speak to my Palestinian friends, when I think about the young Palestinian children who I've met, I think about my own kids, and I look at these young Palestinian kids, and I think how sad that the Palestinian leadership won't even engage and see if there's something in this plan that they could help shape differently. If in the end, after spending a lot of time and good faith negotiations, the peace effort fails, I get it. If the deal is unacceptable to them and no deal that the Israeli government is able to make is unacceptable to them, fine. But if President Trump is reelected in November, and I believe he will be, let's think about that. That will be a total of 8 years of a Palestinian kid's life that is thoroughly wasted. Why? Because of a refusal to engage. I get the fact that they're angry. I get the fact that the leadership is disappointed. I get the fact that the plan doesn't meet their expectations. And by the way, we get plenty of criticism in Israel too for this peace plan. But to refuse to engage and see if you can make it better, to simply say these are my deal points and these are the only deal points that I'll accept, no deal is going to happen that way. And Israel will thrive and prosper. And unfortunately, the Palestinians will fall further and further behind. And that's a tragedy in my mind.
Now, I know that you don't represent the Trump administration now, and these are your opinions looking back on some of this, but don't you think that it might still be salvageable if the Trump administration and Israel were to make some gesture that wasn't considered, I don't want to use the word offensive, but that would challenge what we would hope? For example, the declarations about annexation. I understand that annexation was in the deal of the century. It's not like it's something new. Israel was planning, and under this peace plan, they were going to annex the Jordan Valley. But isn't there something that could be done, in your opinion, if you really believe this plan is worth saving? And I'm assuming you do. Is that correct, that it's worth saving or not?
Oh, I absolutely believe it's worth saving. So, look, it's an interesting question. Since they cut off ties, we were inundated with requests from all over the world. Why can't you just do this or that for the Palestinians?
Right.
Understand a couple of things. Those efforts were tried before, meaning they were encouraged in different ways, including billions and billions and billions of US dollars to the Palestinians to try to encourage them to the negotiating table. It didn't work. And the second thing is the encouragement really is the deal. Here is a proposal. It's a good faith proposal. It has a lot of challenges for both sides. You should be interested in getting to a solution. Take this deal, and that's your approach. It isn't intended to be a carrot, or I think the Arabic word is gazer or something like that. We weren't in the business of trying to give them a carrot or an incentive just to come to the negotiating table, because that's been tried before and it didn't work. The carrot is the deal is on the table. Go through it. And in good faith, come back with a proposal. And if you don't want to, you do that at your risk. It's your prerogative. But if you really think that the UN is going to deliver some deal that Israel is going to be stuck with, I don't think that's ever going to happen. I think that's terribly misguided.
Do you think there's a cost to Israel that the process isn't moving forward? I mean, if I were Israeli, I would think that I'm getting a lot of what I want, and that the Palestinians, by rejecting it, are basically making it easy for me to get what I want. But on the other hand, long term, that uncertainty hasn't changed. Since Oslo 27 years ago, the failure to achieve something seems to have created an environment that could be threatening to Israel.
I think as Israel has lived in a threatened environment and uncertainty from the moment of its inception. I think they've accepted that. One of the reasons we designed the plan the way we did, which is to actually say, Israel, you can take over this land if the Palestinians don't engage, but we have demarcated an area of land for the Palestinians, and we gave them 4 years to come to terms with the idea of negotiating because we wanted to protect Palestinian interests. But I think what our conclusion was, and this plan reflects, that time does march on. We can no longer let the Palestinian Authority have a veto card on Israel's progress. I wish we could no longer let the Palestinian Authority have veto on Palestinians' progress, but that's out of our hands. But at least we try to protect their interests. And all that we ask of the Palestinian leadership, besides obviously trying to figure out how to deal with their own governments, is to sit down and negotiate. Another point is the Israelis have just elected a unity government, have just formed a unity government. Instead of welcoming the fact that there's a unity government, so there's broad consensus in Israel, and it is no longer the kind of right-wing government that existed just prior to its formation, the Palestinian leadership roundly rejected this unity government and said it's the worst thing ever. I don't have the exact quotes with me, but lots of rhetoric about how this is a terrible government. Well, that's the reality. This is a government that actually embraced the peace plan. You had both Benny Gantz and Bibi Netanyahu endorse the peace plan and express a willingness to engage with the Palestinian leadership on it. They should welcome that as an opportunity to engage, not actually throw it all out.
I had two questions. One was, is there any possibility that if the Palestinians were to change, and I'm assuming there's still time, that if tomorrow or soon or at some point, if the Palestinians turned around and said, yes, let's negotiate over this plan, would that door still be open, or is there a deadline or a time, in your opinion, where it just makes it irrelevant, or is that door open for them to walk back?
So I'm speaking not as a White House official anymore.
Right, as an individual, someone who understands this peace process.
The Donald Trump that I know and the Jared Kushner and the David Friedman, for sure the door is open.
Yeah.
But that door, and I'm not saying the door will close, but the door might close on the annexation piece. The annexation piece, they're talking about a July 1st date. I don't know the inside baseball on when and if that'll happen. Happen to support it strongly. But if they wait too long and the annexation happens, then it happens. But in any case, these are guys who are obviously dedicated to the State of Israel. Our relationship with the State of Israel is of paramount importance to the United States of America for so many reasons. But they are also, like me, people who are dedicated to trying to not only resolve the conflict, but to help the Palestinian people. And I know them to be people that if President Abbas or Saeb Erekat called and said, we're ready to talk, they would, in a moment's notice, sit down and talk with them.
Okay. And then the other question I wanted to, or at least point I wanted to bring up was, you're correct, Israel does have a unity government, but they specifically, Gantz specifically seemed to go out of his way to push the Arab joint list aside, which is 15 members of the Knesset. I briefly spoke with Ahmed Tibi, and he indicated that their position is to oppose annexation. Do you think there's any chance, given the fact that the Palestinian government is walking back away from the Oslo Peace Accords, that it might be worth reaching out to the Arab Unity, the Joint List, their coalition, to see if there's a chance that you could work through them? Or is that, and again, this is your opinion, not the administration's, is there any chance that they could play a role in helping to bring about peace?
I don't know the inside baseball on the joint list so well. My experience has been that they were not helpful. First of all, we wanted to, out of respect to the Palestinian leadership, only deal with the Palestinian leadership.
Correct, I understand that.
President Abbas was the leader, is the leader. So we felt it would be disrespectful to try to speak to others. But I have not seen comments out of them other than negative ones, so I don't think they would be a helpful force for peace.
If you were able to talk to President Abbas one more time directly, what would you say to him at this point? Because you put a lot of work, 3 years into this plan, a lot has gone into it. What would you say to him to convince him that he should come to the table and give this peace plan at least the basis for discussion to move forward?
I would say that I and my colleagues at the White House and throughout the U.S. administration have put a lot of heart and soul into this plan. My own family separated from me for almost 3 years. I only got to see them on part of the weekend to allow me to work on this peace process. I didn't do it for the benefit of myself. I live here in the United States, thankfully a very comfortable life. But I did it because I want to see President Abbas's grandchildren live really, really great lives. And I would say that despite the disappointment in I could say the plan, but the truth is that they trashed the plan even before it officially came out. Despite their disappointment, perhaps their anger, the United States remains committed to peace. I think that President Trump is the type of leader who can achieve peace. I think the Israeli government, and I know Bibi Netanyahu well, if he can be assured of Israel's security and the things that are essential to reach a peace agreement, we can reach peace in this time. But to do so, it's going to require President Abbas to be a strong leader. It's going to require compromise. And I would strongly encourage him to try. I think it's a tremendous missed opportunity at a very unique time in history between Israel and its Arab neighbors. And I would really, really be sad for the Palestinian people if they're left behind and out of this historic time.
If the Palestinians were to counter this whole thing, what would you say to them in terms of what Israel is doing to compromise? Are they compromising? Critics might say they're getting almost everything that they want. All the settlements, a majority of the original area of Palestine, even the West Bank. They would get I think it's 20% of the West Bank, correct? And there might be some land swaps. But is Israel compromising on something that, what are they doing to give into this process?
Based on the negative reactions that we get from certain segments of Israeli society, Israel is definitely compromising. First of all, let's remember that Israel has already given up a very significant portion of the land that it captured in what I view as a defensive war in 1967. So Israel has already compromised a great deal by giving up land for peace. What Israel seems to be unwilling to do, and I think they're correct, is to give up more land only to find no peace. So they are giving up a very significant portion of what I call Judea and Samaria, what others call the West Bank, what I know Palestinians like to call occupied Palestinian territory. But this was never Palestinian territory. It's true there was a country called Palestine, but Palestine was comprised of Jews and Arabs. People forget and they pretend that this land was, they act as if this country called Palestine was an Arab country for Palestinians. That's just not true. So I think Israel is giving up a great deal, and I think Israel would, with open arms, welcome our peace plan if they could be assured of their safety and security. So I do think that they are compromising, or would be compromising.
And I think a good thing about what we're doing is I don't always agree with everything that you say, and I know you don't always agree with everything I say, but the discussion and engagement, I do agree, is essential and important for both sides to move forward. And I think personally, this is my own opinion, I think the Palestinians should engage. They should have been at Bahrain. They should be talking about the deal of the century, whether they like it or not. It gives them an opportunity to try to engage and bring change. Not participating, I think, is just self-destructive in my own opinion. Now, you've moved on to personal things. I wanted to ask you about Our Crowd. You're doing other things. It must be a big relief that getting out of that 3-year cycle of the way this has evolved to actually work toward building working with a company, Our Crowd, to find ways to invest money. And I know one of your focuses is on the Middle East. What do you think might come of that? And is it contingent on the Palestinian-Israeli peace accord to actually, not just for you, but for Israel and other interests that are close to Israel to actually make headway in the Arab world and Muslim world?
I don't think it's contingent on an accord to make headway, but I do think we'll eventually probably hit a glass ceiling. I think during the 3 years of President Trump's presidency that I was there, we saw a lot of change. So you had Prime Minister Netanyahu visiting the late Sultan of Oman. That's a big deal. So the Israeli national anthem being sung in Abu Dhabi. Lots and lots of change. And I give the leadership lots of credit. And it's why I want President Abbas to get involved in these things, because he too can be that kind of statesman to show that the world is ready for change, even if we are not yet at the point of peace. But I would say I'm excited because this region, which is comprised of so many young people, you have a number of things going on. A very, very young population. Oil prices, being what they are not the future anymore. Hearts and minds there that are invested in technology and thirst for technology and new business opportunities. This region could be something spectacular and probably outpace certain other areas of the world if they work together. Our crowd has a lot of high-tech companies that I'm excited about, that I'd love to see working hand-in-hand with countries in the region. It's going to be a long slog. I'm a patient guy. I have 6 kids. I guess one of my strengths is because I'm a father of 6 kids. I have a tremendous amount of patience and endurance and optimism. So I'm prepared for that. But I believe that within the next several years, we're going to see a lot of change in the region with respect to business. Things that were under the table are now open, and people really want it. And in all my private conversations, and I've talked to people who are, very much in favor of what we do, but also plenty of people who hate everything we've done in the 3 years that I was at the White House. Very rarely do I hear people say that they think that the ways of the past of isolating Israel and cutting Israel off were smart. Most of them understand that it was a very bad mistake, that the region has only lost because of it, and that they could do so much better together, working together with their young folks and the technologies they could develop together and act as a region to compete with other parts of the world. I would say the vast majority of people that I've spoken to believe that.
I agree with you. I think the Arab world will be very willing to expand relations with Israel if there is a resolution of the Israel-Palestine conflict and get past that ceiling, which I do know exists, and maybe achieve a two-state solution, which I understand you support, correct? A two-state solution, that's something that you support?
What I support is the type of state that we described in the plan. I don't use the phrase two-state solution simply because it's a 3-word phrase that you can't possibly summarize this extraordinarily complicated conflict with those 3 words. The way I would describe it is I support a realistic Palestinian state that adheres to the roughly 60 to 80 page plan that we developed with whatever compromises the 2 sides are willing to engage in. But ultimately, what I would like to see is a thriving Palestinian state that is safe and secure next to a safe and secure Israeli state. But that thriving Palestinian state is going to come with criteria. If it adheres to the criteria, then there won't be an issue. If it doesn't adhere to the criteria, then all the more reason why that criteria needed to be established. What I don't want to see is a Palestinian state that ultimately ends up threatening Israel, and then Israel gets condemned by the United Nations or the rest of the world for securing its people's safety. That isn't fair to ask of any government, and it's certainly not something the United States would ask of one of its strongest allies. But it's also not fair to ask the Palestinians to live in a way that's substandard. I don't think our plan does that. I think our plan gives the Palestinians every opportunity in the world if its leadership plays its cards right and acts according to the rules. There's nothing in there that would prevent any of my Palestinian friends from becoming as successful and as happy as and everything else that the Israeli population is well known for. Are they going to have limits on their military and restrictions on things that involve security? Yes, that's just the reality. If we didn't have the 70 years of conflict that Israel was subjected to, things would be different. But it would be foolish for us to ignore the past 70 years and just pretend that the region is is like the United States, where it's safe and secure. It simply isn't a safe and secure region.
I appreciate the opportunity to have you talk about some of these issues, Jason. Is there anything else that you wanted to bring up that we might not have talked about that you wanted to mention?
I guess I just want to touch for a moment on one of your points, which is This discourse is so important. There's a lot of misleading information out there. There's a lot of political rhetoric where where people try to undermine whether it's the peace plan or connections between Palestinians and Israelis or Israelis and Arabs. All of that just drives peace further and further away, and it really, really harms lives. What I would like to see are discussions like this with ordinary people, media. Just keep talking. The conversations are difficult, sometimes they're painful, but unless and until we reconnect both societies, Israelis and Palestinians, and of course Israelis and the Arabs, we won't have a stronger chance at making peace. But if we connect everybody and have these heart-to-heart conversations, as difficult as they may be, then we increase the chances of potentially solving the conflict. So thank you so much for the opportunity. I greatly appreciate it.
You're welcome. Jason Greenblatt, the former assistant to President Trump and special representative for international negotiations, the primary architect of the deal of the century, as it's informally called, or formally called by many people. Jason, thank you for joining us. His Twitter handle is @GreenblattJD, and you can look him up on Facebook. Jason, thank you so much for taking this time to talk to us.
Thank you again. Take care.